I had a intense year. This morning I sent a text message. I had anxiety.
Why is that?
I haven't talked about this yet, but
Justin Baldoni is an actor, filmmaker, and a New York Times bestselling author. He co-founded Wayfarer Studios with films like It Ends With Us and Will and Harper. Justin is the co-host of the Man Enough podcast.
There was a lot of vulnerability in the film that you just released.
this is a movie about trauma and ending generational cycles. Violence against women, as we know, is not a woman's issue, it's a man's issue. And no amount of I'm sorry's will ever undo it. Hurt people hurt people.
You've talked a lot about your relationship with your own father.
I didn't want to have any more barriers. I let go of so much and I gave it to him. He looked at me and he said, I'm so sorry. Will you forgive me?
We find it very interesting that the majority of you who watch and listen to this show aren't yet subscribed to our channels across Spotify, Apple, YouTube. It would mean the world to us if you can do us that small kindness. It allows us to continue to bring on amazing guests week after week and continue to provide you with amazing value and content. It's the only thing we'll ever ask of you. If you can hit that follow or subscribe button, it would mean the world to us. Thank you so much and enjoy the episode. Justin, I'm really excited to have this conversation with you. I want to say welcome to Gent's Talk. We're filming at the Man Enough podcast studio, which I'm really also excited about because I watch the podcast. I listen to the podcast.
Thank you, man.
This is a long time coming, and I think I want to start it off just by sharing a little story, if I may.
Oh, please.
When I met my current partner, Mila, she one day came to me and gave me your book, and I didn't know what to expect from it. And at first I was a little resistant to it. I was just like, okay, what is this about? And I was still on this process and journey of understanding my masculinity in general. I was still in the middle of a divorce, a messy one. It was the middle of the pandemic. It was sort of navigating all these different things. I'm thinking to myself, I just want to become a better man. How do I do that? Because the version of masculinity that I had grown up with was just not working for me anymore. And when she gave me your book, I was resistant to it. And I didn't actually read it until I watched your TED Talk. And then I thought, okay, this isn't just some film actor who decided to try and capitalize on a market. There's a genuine passion and interest in pushing the narrative forward around what it means to be a man today. And then when I started to continue on this journey of discovery of masculinity and all these topics, you kept popping up in different ways. So for me, this is kind of a full circle moment just to be able to have this conversation with you. So I just want to say firstly, thank you for joining me for this conversation. But I wanted to...
First of all, thank you, Samir. That's really sweet. And can I ask you what the resistance was? I mean, I think I know what it was, but I'm just curious in you, what was it?
Fear.
Of what?
Fear that growing up a certain version of myself, I had to hold on to everything. I grew up with, we were talking before we started rolling, a father who was very loving, told me he loved me, showed me affection, but was never really vulnerable, never really showed me his real emotions.
Yeah.
And for the most part, never saw him cry, and I didn't have any male role models in my life who also showed that. And so I was generally reprimanded by masculinity, by society, by the people in my circle, if I ever tried to show emotion. And so I always thought that this was how I had to be until one day it all came crashing down. Found myself in the middle of a divorce because I didn't show up as a good partner, a good husband, a good friend. Found myself with no men in my life that I could actually have a real honest conversation with. I kept looking around like, where is everybody? And that still, there's a part of me that's still unlearning a lot of those things. And it takes time. And I don't ever think I'm ever going to completely close that. I think it's just a general process of learning and relearning because as life happens and evolves. I'll tell you a very funny story. So Mila was traveling. She put her little leather tag on the suitcase that I use, and it has a little heart on it. And I removed, and then the other tag has her information on it. I removed just the heart. And she asked me why. And I said, I don't know. And I had to actually stop and think about it. And I realized that little boy inside immediately jumped in and said, hearts are for girls. And so there's still parts of me that are still unlearning some of these things. And that's where the resistance came in. And through Gent's talk and having the conversations that we have on the podcast, it's this idea of, selfishly, I'm learning from the Gents.
Yeah.
But also I'm hoping that whoever looks up to those individuals, whoever is inspired by what they do, whether creatively, in business, in life, sees that information, hears that information and goes, okay, maybe I do want to try something differently. So I think that's where a lot of it has come from. There's still an unlearning that's going on.
I mean, that's every single human on this planet.
Yeah.
And did you eventually read the book?
So I'm listening to the audiobook.
Oh, the audiobook.
Yeah. I like to listen to podcasts, so I like to listen to the audiobook.
Yeah.
And I'm going to ask you about a particular section in a moment, but
yeah, it's interesting. You're not the first person that had resistance to the book, and you're not the first man who was given the book by a woman. I have to believe that probably, 60 or 70% of all of the people who bought the book were women giving it to men in their life. And I think that's beautiful. And it also says a lot about where we are. It's one of the reasons why I took my face off the cover of the paperback, because I think there was a lot of resistance to reading the book with my face on the cover, for a lot of reasons. And I wanted to lower the barrier to entry as much as possible, because men are hard to reach because we're hard to reach. And I want to eliminate as many barriers so that whether it's in language, whether it's, why I don't ever say the word toxic when I refer to masculinity.
Why is that?
Because I don't believe masculinity is toxic. And I think it's become politicized. I think toxic masculinity has been a term and a phrase that's been weaponized, and then used against men to make men feel less than. And I've found that even if there are aspects of masculinity that are carried to excess that end up being harmful to both men and the women and the people in their lives, nothing good ever comes from pointing the finger at somebody. Like if we were in a conversation and we didn't know each other and I was coming at you like this, your instinct would be to retreat.
Yep.
Or it would be to puff up and come back.
Yep.
And
both of which don't work.
Don't believe that either one of those things foster unity. And I think what we need more of is compassion, understanding, and empathy. And I also believe it's important to, regardless of whether there is an oppressor or an oppressed, to acknowledge hurt where it exists and in whom it exists. And I think men are hurting overall. So I don't use the word toxic masculinity because I also think it's become enmeshed with identity politics.
Especially now.
And I am trying to take this conversation of masculinity out of politics. And I think that's the only way forward, honestly. So all that to say, very grateful. And I've had the chance to listen and to watch you speak. And, it's funny because I remember I was watching something that you had done, a panel, and you were giving an intro, and it sounded a lot like myself. And I found myself being so happy. And I was watching myself watching you. And I think there was a part of me maybe, 15 or 20 years ago that would have been confused or he's saying stuff that I say, and feeling intimidated or there's not enough room. And I found myself joyful that somebody like you was starting a platform that was having success in Canada, that was dedicating his time to service, to help men become better, that you were on a journey yourself to become better. And I just kind of gave myself a pat on the back because I was like, oh, wow, this is a lot of work that's been done to get to a place where I don't have any ego in this work in that sense, because there is room for all of us.
I'm thinking as you were talking, you kept referring back to, that version of you that existed, 10, 15, 20 years ago. What would I need to know?
Yesterday, sometimes.
Today, tomorrow, it still creeps up.
This morning.
What would I need to know about the man sitting in front of me to understand who you are today?
Who I am today? What would you need to know?
Yeah. Because people see you from the outside. They see the successful actor. You have a podcast. You're an author. You're a speaker. You're an entrepreneur. By all accounts, you've checked off all the boxes. But one, all, none of those things may describe who you really are. So who's Justin at your core?
This morning I sent a text message to my best friend Jamie and the president of my company, Tara. And I told them that I wasn't in the best place. I told them that I was exhausted, that I haven't given myself time to recover or time to heal. I had a intense year, a lot of material success, and a lot of emotional stress. It was very hard on me and my family. And I wear a lot of hats, and I carry a lot, because I love what I do. I love the company I built, the brand that we've built. I love the people that work for us. I love the movies that we make. I love the impact that we have. And yet, sometimes it's easy to, as you said earlier, fall back into our programming and be swept away in the current of self and be kind of overtaken by the wave of success and opportunity. And I sent this text this morning and I just said, I love you both. I just need you to know I'm not in the best place. I woke up at 4:30 this morning. My son's had the flu. I'm not feeling great. My heart was racing. I'm noticing that, I'm having some anxiety. And when I check in with myself, I realize that I just haven't given myself the time to heal from this year that I needed. So let's prioritize our time, and let's make sure that the things that we say yes to are things that we really feel will move the needle forward and can have impact. And I shared that with them. And then I texted my assistant and I said, hey, in the spirit of vulnerability, I just need you to know, because you are my right hand, I need you to know where I'm at emotionally. And I then shared that text message with him. And then I sent a similar text message to my publicist, Jen, who's here, by the way. And I bring that up because she asked me, what do you need to know about who I am? And who I am is a work in progress. And who I am is somebody who is always trying to be radically sincere and authentic to myself so that I can be of service in the best way possible and have the most impact. And sometimes I can get lost in the same way that everybody gets lost. But healing isn't linear and growth isn't linear. And if you don't have setbacks, and if you don't have plateaus, then you don't have the opportunity to regroup and to push forward. So I share that with you because while I look like I am all of those things, and on paper I am also just like everybody else in the sense that I take on more than I can chew. I overcommit. I say yes to things out of fear. I people please.
Even now,
Absolutely. I think we have to dispel the myth that so many thought leaders or self-help gurus or podcast hosts, authors have the keys to the kingdom. Like, we have to dispel the myth that that the grass is greener, that just on the other side, like, if we can just get there, then we'll be in bliss and enjoying and happiness. That's not the case. Bliss and joy and happiness are here now, wherever you are. We can always improve, but I think the trap of masculinity is that we're on a never-ending quest for improvement. I mean, that's why, like, you go down, you look at what men are listening to or what men are reading. Like, we're just trying to be better, which is why I have so much empathy and compassion for men. We're just trying to be better. We want to be better. We want to be better for everybody in our lives, for our wives, our children, our husbands, if we have them, for our fathers, for our children, for our friends, for our company, for our bosses, for our employees. Like, the men that I know and the men that I experience in the world are not the enemy. They are just trying to be the best versions of themselves because they've grown up in a society that tells them that they're not enough the way that they are, that they have to be more or better so that they can provide, so they can protect, so that they can be in the top 10% of men in the dating apps, so that they can find a partner.
And if you don't achieve those things, you've somehow failed.
Your masculinity is in question.
Yep.
And then what happens when your masculinity is in question? You fall into depression. You have anxiety. You feel like you're failing, that you're not showing up to anything as your full authentic self. You compensate. That's when you start to hurt yourself and other people. And that's why we have men that are dropping like flies from cancer, cardiovascular disease, or suicide. Yep. And so back to your question, this is a long-winded way of answering it. I share all of that because I also want to dispel this myth of having it all together, of perfection, of like the guy who wrote the books on masculinity, who did the TED Talks, who seems like he's healed and has it all together. Today, sitting down here with you before we came, I had anxiety because I'm not feeling like my full self. And yet I came today despite, no sleep and not feeling great and, all of the barriers, because of also the work that you do and the potential for the work that we can do together and what this conversation can have for the man who's sitting there, who maybe is feeling the way that I'm feeling today. So I thought, okay, what an opportunity to share radically and honestly who I am today, how I'm feeling this morning. And it might feel different tomorrow. But if I keep that to myself and I don't share it, then I don't give you or any man who's listening permission to do the same.
Permission is the key word there, isn't it? I remember the first time I ever experienced vulnerability from another man, it felt like I was finally given the permission to do the same.
Of course.
And I was shocked by it all.
Yeah.
I was taken aback. I remember picking up the phone and I settled on the name of a guy that felt a little more like a stranger than like a friend, because I was like, there's some familiarity, but a little bit.
You were picking up the phone because you needed to talk to somebody?
To talk to someone, yeah.
Yeah. Was this going through your divorce?
Yep.
Yeah.
So it was about maybe a month or so after everything had been official, like we're done, we're split up, all those things. And
this was a divorce that you feel like you take responsibility for,
Well, that's the interesting part. I took on all of the responsibility. It took me a long time to learn that, yes, I have responsibility on myself for the way I didn't show up, the way I could have been better.
But there were two people.
Yeah. And it took me a while to unlearn that. But in the moment, I needed just to call to talk to someone, because I was afraid of talking to therapists, because in my mind, I'm like, therapy is for crazy people. Like, guys don't talk to therapists. And I was stuck in that mode. And so I picked up the phone and I called him, and he's now one of my best men in the world. And as soon as I picked up the phone, ready to talk about, the pandemic, sports, anything, he goes, Samir, I am really anxious today. I'm fighting with my partner. I can't make any money. It's the pandemic. I'm trying to compete to go to the Olympics. He's a professional volleyball player. And I can't do any of that stuff. And I just feel like the worst version of myself today. And before I could say anything else, I just was like dumbfounded. My shoulders finally fell back. And I thought to myself, wow, this is the vulnerability thing everyone's talking about. I think I finally just got to experience it. And I couldn't judge him. I couldn't laugh at him. I couldn't criticize him. All I wanted to do was just create a space for him to continue sharing. And I realized
you were the one that originally needed the space.
Yeah. And in some way, being able to give him that space also made me a little more empathetic with myself. That I'm like, maybe this is what I really needed. But also showed me that I had now the permission to also lead with vulnerability. And the vulnerability is a strength. It's not a weakness. And for the men out there who laugh at that exact statement, for most part, it's probably because they've just never had the ability or the privilege to experience it because they've been surrounded by other men who also don't share it or experience it. And when you have conversations with women who talk about, like we have a lot of women that listen to the Gents Talk podcast, and a lot of the feedback has been, I'm sincerely hoping that, you know, my husband, my partner, my brother, my father, my son will finally listen to this and go, now maybe he feels like he's got the permission because he saw so-and-so have this conversation. Can you remember the first time you were given permission to be vulnerable or shown it?
Well, I thank you for sharing that. I love that. And what a badass your friend is for doing that. You know, I always think that there's these invisible forces at play. You know, I'll get to your question, but I can't help but think, like, I go into like a deep spiritual philosophy of this idea that the people that love us the most that aren't here anymore are just guiding us in these beautiful ways that one day we'll find out. And I always think about like when I go and I move on to the next world or meet the creator or go to heaven or whatever it is that most people believe in, I'm gonna be like, all right, which one of you told me to call that guy? Which one of you? Who was it? I want to know. How did you? And I'm like, because I can feel so often the nudge.
Yeah.
And then you look back and there was nobody else that you could have called that would have led you to where you are now except him. And the fact that you called him was a mix of your own intuition, but also there was a nudge from somewhere. And so I just I think I'm just in a place where I'm also really wanting to talk a lot about spirituality and the belief in the existence of something greater. And so when I hear these little things, it just reinforces that belief to me, because I mean, I function constantly asking for that guidance and then trying to listen. But back to your question. I read about it in the book. I talk about it in the TED Talk. There are a lot of men ready and willing.
Just waiting.
Who are ready, who want to go deep, who want to have these conversations, who want to have these relationships with their friends. And then there's a lot of men who maybe don't know they want it.
So how do you get to those men? Because in all the things that I've been doing over the last couple of years, when I have a conversation with another man, or I deliver a talk, or I do a podcast, and a man says, wow, that was really great, I was connected to that. The panel, for example, I was like, this is great. We see so many men in the audience, but those are men that are already in a position of wanting to improve themselves. To some degree, those are the men that were already, working their way towards becoming healthier men. The ones who are still stuck, the ones who maybe don't even know what all of this feels like, the importance of it. How do you specifically speak to those men?
Well, look, again, it's a work in progress. If I had figured it out, the world would look different,
Yeah.
It's something that I'm always thinking about, that I'm trying to wrap my head around. For me, I never allow myself to be in a silo. So I'm always trying to listen and understand someone who has a different point of view to myself. And I'm always willing to have my point of view adjusted. So I'd like to believe that I have enough humility to know that I don't know. I might think that I know. I might say it with authority. I might give a data point. I might speak like I'm speaking now and, seem right or righteous. And yet I am really willing to have my point of view changed.
Do you ever find, as someone who does the work that you do on the platforms that you have, to openly say, I don't know something, or when you're in your, when it's just you by yourself realizing that you don't know how to do something, do you ever feel like an imposter?
Oh, I think I'll speak for myself. I feel like an imposter all the time.
I struggle with that one.
Well, I think we all do. I genuinely believe if we were honest with ourselves, it'd be nearly impossible with the way that we've set up society to not feel that way. Because we live at a time that, how do I say this? We live in an age where capitalism is rampant and it feeds off of insecurity and the feeling like we're not enough. And so the world is set up in a way, media is set up in a way to constantly remind us that we aren't enough as we are. And we need that thing or that thing or that thing to become enough, so that we buy and we improve. I don't believe capitalism can work in a society where everybody feels like they're enough and that there's true contentment. Because we wouldn't have the need to buy everything. We wouldn't have the need to become the 1%.
Yeah.
Because so much of that is about, it's no longer about, Maslow's hierarchy of needs at that point. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about becoming elite, high performers. We're talking about living to 150 now and biohacking and all of this stuff is like, if you strip it all away, it's rooted in this quest, this search, because I think at its core, we're not enough. And anyways, I go back to imposter syndrome. I think I believe we all have it. There are some that don't. I study those. I have some of those in my life that don't have it. And yet, if you take a certain person that doesn't have it and you put them in another situation and you ask them to perform there, they'll have a version of imposter syndrome. But that's just the voice in our head telling us that, that reminding us that, we're 6 or 8 or 12 or whatever age we were when this idea was reinforced that we weren't enough.
So how do you, when you find yourself in a moment of feeling like the imposter, what do you say to yourself? What do you do to pull yourself out of that? Because there are moments where I'm feeling it and I go, I know right now I don't feel like I belong here. I feel like a phony.
Yeah.
And then I'm self-aware enough to know that I'm doing that, but I can't pull myself out of it. I almost just have to let it run its course or wait for some sort of dopamine hit of another kind to
pull you out of it.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. I think that's beautiful. I think a lot of men and people that are listening can relate to that. I know I can. What do? I speak it out loud.
You externalize
it. I actually will acknowledge that I'm feeling it. Whether to a person, to my wife, or even to myself. I oftentimes will then question that voice, and I'll say something like, but what if it's not true? The idea, like anxiety, comes from us like predicting that our future is going to suck, predicting that something bad's going to happen. Us feeling not enough is looking at the people that we're around or the situation that we're in and feeling like we don't have anything to contribute, that we aren't special, that we don't have value. And generally that comes from a place of us that just needs love. And I try to tell myself that what if that voice that's being an inner critic is lying to me? What if it's not true? What if it's not true? Oh, they're going to know. Or what if I what if my brain doesn't work? Like this morning, I woke up and I was like, man, I'm going to go and I want to show up authentically as my full self and be of service. But I haven't slept well the last few days and I'm off. And God, what if I like disappoint? And what if the people that are listening are like, oh, this guy, you know, whatever they would say, whatever bad thing in my mind in that moment comes up. And I just will say to myself, like this morning, like, but what if that's not true? What if I do show up like I always do? What if because I'm showing up and I'm of service and I'm a clear channel, that God will work through me and that I'll say exactly the thing I need to say for the one person who needs to hear it. And I try to replace the negative thought with a positive one. I mean, it's cognitive behavioral therapy. It's like, it's meditation. It's changing your current state and imagining what a different future would look like and not listening to that part of yourself. You know, it's like being aware, you know, when you have a negative thought, like, you know, there's the idea that you have a rubber band and you snap the rubber band every time you have a bad thought. And then eventually you'll remind yourself before you have to snap the rubber band that the thought isn't real. Mm-hmm. Like, it doesn't matter what it is that we do. The main thing that we have to do, that I do, is I just try to hold space for the part of myself that feels less than and give it love and give it grace and not beat the shit out of myself like I did for so many years for feeling that way.
Like so many of us do.
Because if I showed up here today, as an example, if I didn't do what I did this morning, and I showed up here today feeling not enough, and I was overcompensating, then I wouldn't be authentic. You would feel it.
Yep.
You'd say something's off. I think the audience would feel it. And I've done that before. I've been in, I mean, how many times have you been in a situation in your life where you meet somebody or you're around a group of people and you're not feeling confident, you're not feeling yourself, you're feeling not enough, and you puff out your chest and you say something, and then there's a little voice inside your head that's like, you fucking idiot. Justin, Samir, what? You don't even believe that. Why did you say it?
Yeah.
And then then it's a double beat down because you're already not feeling good enough to be there. And then you're beating yourself up for saying something that you shouldn't have said because you're trying to prove that you should be there.
Yep.
And then you just dig a hole deeper and then you leave and then you feel worse and then you start the spiral. And that's when you need the dopamine hit. That's when then you get on social media. That's when you go buy something on Amazon.
Yep.
That's when you drink. That's when you smoke. That's when you make a bad decision. And this is the self-awareness and the knowing that I think we have to unravel and start to get to as men. So I'll tell myself it's not true. I'll say, well, what if it's the opposite? What if we have an amazing conversation? What if I show up exactly as I am right now and that's enough? And that is something that I was never taught. My dad never taught me that. No one in school ever taught me that. I didn't have a male mentor that taught me that. I was always taught to show up and be better than. But what if we show up as we are and that is enough and that is worthy of love? And that's our unique gift. Radical sincerity, radical honesty, radical vulnerability.
Speaking of radical vulnerability, there was a lot of vulnerability in the film that you just released, Ends With Us. Particularly in terms of the requirement for men to take an honest look at themselves and how they show up in relationships. I watched it recently with my partner, Mila. And when your character shows up on screen and was extremely charismatic and charming and all of those things, she turned to me and she goes, every woman has dated this guy. And I had to pause and ask her, what did you mean by that? And she said, the guy that shows up very charismatically, says all of the right things, behaves the way he thinks other men should in a relationship, the way they're supposed to show up in a relationship. And then turns out that he's either insecure, he's not emotionally regulated, he's got something going on, and he's overcompensating. I think the first thing after I finished watching that film was thinking to myself, knowing from the outside about you and the work that you do, it made me wonder, how do you go from being Justin Baldoni, the guy who has this podcast, these conversations, to putting on that facade for that film, to play a role that seems radically different to who you are at your core?
Well, if you compartmentalize this character of Ryle as an example, and you remove the abuse. So let's just remove that for a second. So I want to talk about the character outside of the abuse, because what he does in the movie is unforgivable, and there's no excuse, and no amount of I'm sorry's will ever undo it or fix it. He blew up his life, and he deserved to lose his family. So I want to just separate these things for a second. Outside of that, if you just look at Ryle's personality and who he is, outside of the abuse, I've been that guy. I put on that mask. I tried it in my 20s. I remember having the worst time dating. I had 2 relationships. Both failed. The first one was emotionally abusive and ended in cheating and infidelity. And the second one ended the same way. Both of which were relationships where I was pretending to be somebody for a certain time, only to be discovered that I was not that person, just as Mila said, because I was trying to impress. I was putting on a show. I was trying to be what I thought a man should be. You know, it's monkey see, monkey do. Like, that's how we learn as men. It's like, oh, that worked for that guy. I need to be that. Oh, that guy got that girl. She's really hot. What's he doing? Let me study that. What does he look like? Oh, he's got big arms and biceps. Maybe that's what it is. Let me grow my arms and biceps. Oh, his hairstyle is like that. Let me change my hairstyle. Oh, I like how he dresses. Let me dress like that.
I like the way he talks, the way he moves.
Oh, yeah. And we study. And that's what I like. And of course, women do this too, but we study men. You know, we study them. And we try to figure out through a process of elimination almost how to be like the men we see successful at something. Because that's what we're trying to be. We're never taught to try to be who we are. We're taught to look out from the time that we're kids. We want to fit in. We want to be like the other boys. Part of that is we don't want to be bullied and left out.
Yep.
We want to keep our man card. This is the most expensive admission to any club in the world because it requires us to give up who we are to keep admission. We never talk about that. We're willing to hurt people, to hurt ourselves. We're willing to keep secrets that shouldn't be kept.
Yeah. Lie.
We're willing to lie, steal, cheat. In many situations, kill. To keep our admission to this club that doesn't benefit us at all. What we should be taught is instead of seeking out, we should be going in. What do I like? What music do I like? What makes me feel joyful? What brings me joy? What do I like to do? But instead, and I know this because I'm watching my son who's 7, and I'm watching how his natural joy can be taken away once he gets to school. The things he loves to do, his freedom, his goofiness. When he gets to school, even though it's a beautiful school and there's amazing kids in the school, there's other boys that are a bit older that are already starting to have the walls close in on him, that are already starting to tell him, and via bullying, via teasing, whatever it is, that the way he's doing it is wrong. And I'm watching that happen, and we need to figure out how, and this is what I'm trying to do with my son, how to raise our boys. And for us, it's because I don't believe it's ever too late to recapture our true essence, to recapture our joy, to ask ourselves, what do we like? If no other man existed, what would we do? How would we act? What would we wear? What would we listen to? Would we dance? Would we be silly? Would we be goofballs? Would we watch romantic movies?
Would we cry?
What would we do? If we felt something, would we allow ourselves to feel it? Mm-hmm. And we don't do that. And yet that's the secret ingredient to joy and happiness and success. So I'm watching my son, and I'm constantly trying to remind him and praise the things that make him truly who he is. But back to your question, again, I zigzag and I apologize.
Don't.
I've been that guy. I put on that mask. I've tried to be the charismatic guy, the guy that didn't give a shit. I remember being single and just failing miserably because I'd meet a woman and, you know, I'd try to play the game and then I would find myself suffering privately. Like, what am I doing? Let's say it was somebody that I really liked and I wanted to text her, but I couldn't text her because then I'd be showing that I liked her. And if I show that I like her, then she's going to lose interest.
Yeah. You got to play the game.
And this is not just a masculine problem, by the way. You know, Bell Hooks writes about this in A Will to Change. We've all been conditioned in a society such as the one that we are living in today to have internalized misogyny, men and women. And that means that if women are raised in the same culture as men, then women are also programmed in the same way we are. We might be programmed to protect. They may be programmed to want a man who can. And that means that they may be turned off if they feel or sense any sort of weakness or insecurity.
So that right there, the men who hear that, see that, know that, are the type of men who will go, this is why I can't show my true self.
Yeah. I get a lot of those messages. And to that, what I will say is you got to do it anyways. Because nothing will ever change if we wait for the other sex or the other party to give us permission. My entire life changed when I took ownership of this. When I met my now wife, I made a conscious effort to not repeat the patterns from all of my previous relationships or my dating life. And that meant that I went all in, whether or not she was ready. She had a lot of unprogramming to do herself. We had polarity issues. There were moments where we didn't know if we were going to make it, where if you were looking from the outside, it seemed great, but internally we were like, I may have been more in my feminine and she may have been more in her masculine, but that was all just trauma and programming. And if we allow ourselves to risk being hurt, being left, being cheated on, being abandoned, so that we don't abandon ourselves, then I think the reward is freedom. And it's a really hard thing to face. It's a dark night of the soul situation for most men. But I wasn't willing to sacrifice myself anymore for somebody else. I wasn't willing to abandon who I am just so that I could try to get somebody else to love me. Because if that person doesn't love me for who I am, if that person thinks that I'm too much or that I love too big or I show my cards, then that person's got work too. And it's not my job to fix that person. And I had to be willing to risk losing her. And I knew she was the one. But then that's where faith comes in. If she really is the one, and I had prayers to God. I was like, if she really is the one, then let it be. And if she's not, let my attachments fade and let it go away. And we had breaking points, and yet I never wavered in who I was. And I believe that's why at 26, 27, we were able to somehow find our way through, and we've been together for all these years. But if I hadn't done that, if I had, done the Ryle thing, of course, separating the abuse and pretended to be somebody that I wasn't, then it would have never worked.
What's the main message you hope men in particular receive from watching that film?
Men?
Yeah. I've heard you speak about what you're hoping for women to receive from it. And you've talked about the countless messages you've received of women saying to you, like, you know, this actually gave me the courage, or I'm realizing what I need to do. And those are beautiful stories to hear. I'm curious for the men who watch it. I felt a personal sense of accountability after watching it. I've been in environments where, you know, I've had friends who've been emotionally abusive, verbally abusive, and I've said nothing. And I thought to myself, I could
keep
never...
that man card.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking to myself now, I literally started surveying the men in my life, thinking, could I say it to him? Could I say it to him? Could I say it to him? And unequivocally, every single one, yes. I will say, if I see something, I will say it. And I felt a sense of accountability. What message are you hoping the men who are still struggling, may know someone in their life who's that way, similar to Ryle, what are you hoping that they take away from this?
First of all, what you just said was my dream and prayer, that is what a man would experience watching the movie. That's what a man would take away. You know, I haven't talked about this a lot because I want to be very mindful in the conversation around this movie to not take the emphasis off of what is happening to women at alarming rates.
Absolutely.
And yet, I talk a lot about reframing the question from why did she stay to why did he hurt her?
Yep.
And that means that violence against women, as we know, is not a woman's issue, it's a man's issue. So the reason under the reason, the secret reason, which I would never lead with, because this is a movie at the end of the day for women to see themselves. And I prayed that they would see themselves and maybe not even realize that they were in the situation that they were in. And by watching the character in the movie's courage, find the courage themselves. Or that would have a friend that would take them to the movie so that they could experience that. The real reason underneath it all was to affect change in men. And if you create a female event film, of course women are going to go with women, but there's going to be a lot of men that go with women. And that's the other reason why I wanted to direct it and why I wanted to play this character. Because I wanted men to see themselves in each of the men. I wanted men to see what happens when you do not resolve your trauma. I wanted men to see a guy like Ryle, who in his heart is a good man, be unable to control his insecurity, let his fears win and take over, and harm the person he loves the most, the one person who has helped him find himself, who has helped him believe in love again. He hurts her because he never took the time to heal. I wanted men to see that they could lose everything. And I wanted to do it in a way where, in some ways, men felt empathy for Ryle. And if they could feel empathy for Ryle, they could see themselves. The other way to make this movie, which I was really trying to avoid, is to demonize Ryle and to make him the villain. But I knew that I'd lose the men. And for the same reason I don't say toxic masculinity, I didn't want to make a movie like that because we have enough of that. We have enough man-hating movies that exist in the world. But this is a movie about trauma and ending generational cycles. And the majority of men that abuse come from abuse. That's the data. That's what the research says. Hurt people hurt people.
Yep.
And the majority of men who abuse don't change. They can't change. The data also says that the only way for a man generally to stop abusing or to stop hurting a woman is for that woman to leave. And then in the next relationship, he can break the cycle. So what's it like to lose everything? What's it like to be a man, to hold your daughter, who you didn't know you'd ever have, who you didn't know you'd ever find love because you don't feel worthy of love, to finally be holding your daughter while losing her at the same time because of the harm that you inflicted. And then having to make a choice in that moment to protect your daughter from yourself because you realize you're dangerous. That was what I wanted men to emotionally experience as a cautionary tale, because and I've talked a lot about women, and I'm grateful to talk about men. And I've talked about the one Lily Bloom, the one woman in the audience, but deep down there was a hope that there'd be a man in the audience who would recognize his behavior, go and get help, and never harm. And I've had men reach out to me like that, who have thanked me for the movie. And we've stopped those men from harming because they saw what could happen to them. And for that, and for what you said, it makes it all worth it.
Thank you for sharing that.
It's a great question. Thank you for asking.
There was a line in particular at the end of the film while Ryle was holding his daughter.
Yeah.
That stood out to me, where he says he would beg her to leave him.
Yeah.
When asked what he would say if he found out that his daughter was being abused. And it just sort of, again, in that ability to just put yourself in that position and go, if someone I loved was being treated that way, what would I say to them?
Yeah.
You know, you've talked a lot about your relationship with your own father. You've mentioned him a few times here.
Yeah. I love my dad. He's the best.
I've also heard you talk about how he showed up in the best way that he knew how.
Yeah.
And that may not have been what you needed at the time. Like you've even referenced that in our conversation where, you know, your father didn't necessarily model for you how to show up in certain situations. I have this, you know, constant reminder I tell myself that our parents are going through life for the first time, just like you and I are. Mm-hmm. And that a little grace and empathy is needed for them because we're so quick to criticize them.
Yes.
How do you balance the relationship with your father from the lens of seeing where he showed up for you, how he only could, but also forgiving him for not showing up for you the way you think or felt you needed?
It's a great question. I love what you just said. I think it's so important. You know, as I was starting my kind of healing journey, as I was diving into all this work, I uncovered a lot of resentment from my parents. And, you know, I started asking my dad really hard questions. And I was pretty brutal to my dad in my 20s and even in my 30s. And I feel terrible about that because I realize, just like what you said, like he was doing his best. And we're so flawed. That's like one of the things I just want everybody to know is there is no version of us going through this life and being anywhere near perfect. Like there's no version where we're not going to make mistakes or screw up. And that's what makes us human. And what a gift that is that we were given. Freedom from perfection, because it's impossible. And yet we demand it of ourselves and our parents. And so, you know, one of the most beautiful things about my father is his willingness to look at himself, to take feedback and to grow. And as I wrote my first book, I mean, if I could write the book again, I wouldn't be nearly as hard on my dad. Because he didn't just do his best, he did amazing. And I have a totally different perspective now from the seat that I'm in of who he was in my life. so much of who I am, so much of the things that people gravitate towards, so much of my willingness to work on myself and my fearlessness in that capacity comes from my dad. And sure, he didn't model vulnerability, but he didn't know how. And maybe that's my job. Maybe that's what I'm here for. And our kids are always going to be the ones that are our greatest teachers. So what if that was my gift to him? So what if my dad raised me and my mom raised me, and they both had the perfect amount of imperfection that made this soup, that mixed with where I was raised and how I was raised and my genetic predisposition and my relationship with God and all of the things that they instilled in me, that all of those imperfections created the being that I am. And so while, of course, I've had resentments and frustrations, I also know that it couldn't have happened any other way for me to be where I am right now. And it's given me grace to hold that with them and for myself. So, you know, I took my dad, I haven't talked about this yet, but for my 40th birthday, I didn't want a big party. I wanted a very small group of men to be truly vulnerable with. I wanted to take the men that I'm the closest to in this world, and I wanted to create an experience for all of us where we would have our egos smashed and we would have no choice but to show up as our full, authentic, imperfect, broken, beautiful selves. And so I took 11 men to a cabin up in Northern California. And I reached out to some friends. They run an organization called Sacred Sons. And we did this small, intimate men's retreat. And I brought my father. And it makes me emotional. I brought my dad because I didn't want to have any more barriers between him and me. And I wanted to let go of the shit that I was carrying. And I knew how hard it would be. I wanted a initiation that I never got. You know, we used to have tribes and communities where the men would gather and they'd take these boys out, and through some process of initiation, these boys would become men and then would be welcomed into the community. And they'd be supported with male mentors, and they would be taught things, and they wouldn't have to impersonate and mimic and, you know, monkey see, monkey do, like we talked about earlier. They were groomed to become men. And I never got that, and I wanted that. And I wanted that with my father. And what I learned and what I realized is that my liberation would set him free. So I took my dad up. It was him and my best friends. And we went deep and we shared all of our shit. And I let go of so much and I gave it to him. And he held it. And he held it. And he looked at me and he said, "I'm so sorry. I did the best I could do. Will you forgive me?" And I noticed that part of me, that same part of me showed up where I couldn't reach out to my friends, where I couldn't press the phone number, where I couldn't ask for help. That same part of me showed up and I couldn't say the fucking words. And then I opened my eyes and I looked at him and I saw he was crying. And I saw how much he loved me. And I looked around to all my friends who were holding space, who were not judging me. And I saw myself in him, and I saw his innocence, and I saw his purity. And I had so much gratitude for this man that had no idea what he was doing, just like I don't have any idea what I'm doing, who raised me. And I said, "I forgive you. I love you." And we cried together. And we hugged each other. And I held him for all the men in that room who couldn't do it for their fathers. And my dad in that moment showed up in a way that most men will never get to experience. Most men will never get to have that moment with their fathers because their fathers pass away before they could, or because their fathers are just not willing or not able to, and it's not their fault. And every man in that room was healed in that moment because of the actions my father took. That is the power of forgiveness. It's the power of vulnerability. That doesn't even have to be your dad. For you in some way to be healed from me telling you that story. Mm-hmm. That's the power of storytelling. That's the power of community. That's the power of male friendships. So I have grace from my father in the same way that I have grace for myself for being really hard on him, even publicly. But that's where healing happens. And that's what I'm trying to do with my son. I'm trying to show up for my son in the way that my dad showed up for me this year and for the last 40 years. And show my son that I am imperfect and improve on the relationship that I had with my dad. And I'm watching my dad show up for my son in the way that he couldn't quite show up for me, but that he's showing up for me now.
And you get to watch that.
I get to be alive to watch that. And I'm so grateful that I get that. And I just wish that men could experience it. And that's why I share it. That's why I'm this open. Because we're longing to be held by our fathers, by the masculine energy. We're longing to be accepted and loved for who we are without being beaten up and told that we have to do more, be better, be tougher, be stronger. Of course the world is fucking hard. We have to be those things. But we also have to make room for the sensitive, empathetic, compassionate, insecure, kind, fragile parts of us that just needed to be loved and seen for who we are.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, man.
What a powerful moment to witness, to be a part of. And it very much makes me want to go home and pull on that thread with my father that I was telling you about.
And do it gently.
Yeah.
I pulled really hard for a long time because we're always going to be that little boy with our dads.
Yeah.
And once we start to see our fathers as the little boy, everything changes.
I remember the first time I reframed the way I looked at my dad and just thought of him as that scared little boy growing up in a war-torn country, seeing his father get kidnapped, all of these things, and just thinking to myself how scared he must have been and not having anyone to console him, hold him, tell him, you're going to be okay. And that he just had to figure life out. And it just broke my heart when I thought about that.
Yeah.
It still does when I think about it, when I look at him, and no matter how angry I might get at him because he says something or he's stubborn in his old ways. And I'm like, I can't sit here. I got to leave. And I get in the car, and as I'm driving on the highway, just thinking to myself, I'm like, I could have given him a little more just there. Mm-hmm. I didn't need to allow my own emotions to get in the way of that. And so thank you again for sharing that, because that's reminded me of why I need to do that and show up better for my own father.
Yeah. And there are a lot of men who can't do it. And there's a lot of men who were fathers who did a lot of harm. And this is a tricky position to be in. Yeah. And I want to also respect any person who's listening who was harmed by their father, because that's also a separate conversation. And yet we have to acknowledge the harm in some cases, but we can't carry it our whole lives. We got to let it go. We got to set it free. We have to, for the world. Because as we know, man, like we can't, just because harm was caused and we were hurting doesn't mean we can go hurt.
Yep.
And we got to forgive somehow. And every situation is different. And I want to hold space for all the situations that are different. But the vast majority of people just haven't had the opportunity to have a real healing with their parents in that way. And something that has helped me a lot is I think of mortality. I think mortality should be thought of a lot more. I feel like every young person should have a chance to go work in a hospice or, be taken to hospitals. Because I feel like once we understand that we only are here for a finite amount of time, it influences every decision that we make.
And it flies. It flies.
And it flies. It flies by. And so I look at my dad, I look at my mom, and it helps me put things into perspective. Because I don't want to be having a conversation with their casket.
Yeah.
I don't want a one-way conversation. Even though I believe even when they're gone, it'll still be a two-way conversation, as we talked about a little bit earlier. I want a legit two-way conversation. I want to relieve them of that burden while they're here. And I just hope that's something that people can think about. If they still have one of their parents or both, and we can do the same thing with our children. Time is flying by. What are we doing with our time? Where are we spending it? Are we happy? Are we joyful? Are we living in our purpose? Are we doing what we want to do with our lives? These are questions we got to ask ourselves. And if we don't ask ourselves, we cannot be the men we need to be in this world because we don't know ourselves. We're zombies.
I agree 100%.
We're just cogs in the machine. We're grinding. We're hustling. We're breaking our bodies. How do I know? Because I've done it. Because I'm living it. As I told you before I got here, I'm in a moment of it right now. So the conversation for me is healing. Because the more I speak about it, the more I remember. Because sometimes I forget. But you probably know this. One of the root words in Arabic for human is insan, which is translated to they who forget.
Yep.
So we forget. Human beings, we forget everything. We forget our purpose. We forget our joys. We forget our pain and our struggles. And I think it's a beautiful gift that God gave us that we forget. That means the journey is in the remembering.
If you had the opportunity to go back in time and talk to a young Justin, imagine 10-year-old Justin sitting on his bed, thinking to himself about all the different negative things happening to him, his fears, his anxieties, his emotional struggles with understanding his own sensitivities and emotions while also trying to figure out what it means to be a man as he's growing older. If you can give that Justin one piece of advice, the advice that he needed to hear, what would that advice be?
You don't have to be perfect to be loved. That's what I tell myself today. That's what I tell myself when I think about young Justin. And it's what I need to hear. That's what I told myself this morning. I don't have to be perfect to be loved.
That's beautiful. I think we could all use that advice.
The light, the crack is where the light gets in. The wound is where the light enters you. I was raised in the Baha'i faith. Baha'u'llah says, my calamity is my providence. Outwardly it is fire and vengeance. Inwardly it is light and mercy. Every religion teaches the same thing. I think the beauty is in the imperfections.
You know, I'm going to leave this conversation reinvigorated to continue, you know, because to your point, sometimes when you're so in knee deep in the work, you sometimes almost forget what you're doing or why you're doing it. And this has been an opportunity for me to also pull myself out and go, this is exactly why. For these exact conversations, for the people listening, watching, who may stumble upon this next week, next month, next year, 10 years from now, and go, I want to do something different with my life because of that one conversation I heard. Justin, thank you so much for your time.
I appreciate it, Samir.
This was such a pleasure.
Thank you, brother.
I appreciate you.
Yeah, appreciate you.
Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you for tuning in.